so exciting to come to church at those services. I'm Mini Aussie. I'm the outgoing president of the congregation. This is so excited to see you all here. I'm so excited to have Darrell Berger with us today. And what an exciting occasion that this year Darrell is celebrating his 50th year since his ordination. A life in history. Great. They want you to do something. Oh, it's okay. And today is an exciting day because it's our annual meeting. This is the day where we count up everybody as a member and try to figure out if we can get it going. We've been doing that for years.
Can you talk a little bit louder?
Sure. I think there's a buzz.
Yeah. We may not need that air conditioning.
Oh, there you go. Now you're going to give me perfect.
Wow.
Too loud.
Oh, quiet down. Okay, I was saying that, for years, we count up how many members, and you have to have a 30 membership to get quorum, so we always count up and call everybody coming to church because we have to have that annual meeting. It's a bit scary. And Darrell, when he was our minister, got to the point where he's like, what's going on here? How come nobody's joining our church? So that's been hanging over, the sort of Damocles hanging over our head for a long time. So I look forward to all the things, all the wisdom you want to share. But I think for me, you're saying, wait, what is this? Was really a pivot point for me in my thinking. What is this? What are we doing here? And that led to a long period of discernment. What are we doing? Mm-hmm. And should we be doing it? And then we made a pivot, and that brings us to today. So for a long while, we have been doing a new thing, which is using our church as a community space run by the Hub, and using these services as a place to talk about what we see as twin pillars of a good life, faith and works. And so when we invite people into our pulpit, we ask them to talk about their life. What is your faith and how have you lived it? And for me, hearing these once a month over these years, more than 30 of them, often very brilliant speakers, each with a different and unique way of saying their path to a good life, has really given me so much food for thought and so much inspiration, and really deepened my own spiritual practice and moral fortitude. I think we all need moral fortitude in times like this. You wake up minding your own business and you can't breathe the air because smoke came from Canada. I mean, I was never prepared for that to happen in my life. And it's like bumper cars. Life is like bumper cars these days. And you get knocked out of what you were going to do. You have to do something else. And how do you do that new thing with as much spirit of generosity and compassion and love for humanity as you did the day before you got knocked off your path? And so these talks have been something that I reflect on and that I use in my daily life as I get knocked off my path and I try to get back on it. So very exciting, and I'm going to turn it over to Frank, who's going to introduce our beloved Darrell.
Yeah. Could we have the challenge?
Of course. You come up here and do it. Oh, you need to light up while you talk?
You got to make sure it's up over the, because you can't see it behind the pulpit.
Oh, you can see it behind this. You can't see it behind this?
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, we'll bring it on.
There we go.
Bring it to the pulpit and light it.
Sure.
I'll let you light it.
Thank you.
I'm gonna light this one.
Yeah, that's what I want to do. Good.
It is, because otherwise you burn your fingers.
So we light this chalice today in honor of our former minister, and as a recognition of the conclusion of our church year, and to recognize the work that we continue to do. So with that,
I'm just going to put it here and everybody will know.
Yeah.
Good.
It is so great to have Bill Stafford here playing, as Mindy pointed out. Mention that, and you will have more to say. Twin pillars of a good life. Boy, that I like that. I like the way that sounds. You've come up with a lot of good sayings, Mindy. I have to admit. Yeah. So Reverend Darrell Berger served as minister at First Church, here at First Church, from 2008 to 2014. He came at a time when the congregation was rebounding from a difficult ministerial relationship and after a period of healing. That period of healing was conducted by Yilbanzi, for the most part, by the congregation and by Yilbanzi Charles Johnson, who recently passed away. So we were very saddened about that. But as Darrell once told me, he saw his role as a developmental minister, someone who could help the congregation focus on the issues that seemed to be holding them back, explore options, and come up with a plan to move forward. This was Darrell's way of approaching things, and Reverend Berger fulfilled that role admirably. And what we learned from our collective experience was that there were alternatives to delivering UU ministry to Orange. But before we could bring those alternatives to fruition, we had to strengthen our structure. Reverend Berger helped us to do that, developing a plan to preserve the building, working with the board to focus on policy and to get away from programming, coming up with a strategic plan, helping leadership to focus on management. These issues were raised up and brought to light during Reverend Berger's tenure with us. They became the foundation in developing the Hub, our urban our urban outreach program, and the inspiration for our Faith and Works ministry. So it is my pleasure to introduce my friend and former mentor, Reverend Darrell Berger.
Several years ago when I was here, Bill played an interlude similar to that, and it was so great. And one of the reasons I really liked it was uncategorizable. It was jazzy, it was folky, it was traditional, it was Thelonious Monk is what it was, okay? And so I said, please play some uncategorizable Thelonious Monk. Because I've been doing some study about music and the categories of rhythm and blues and folk and bluegrass and all that is just a social construct. And I'm reminded of what Louis Armstrong said about what kind of music he liked. He said, I like good music. Thank you so much. That is really nice. Now, one of the privileges of being ordained 50 years ago now is I completely threw out the sermon I'd been working on for about 3 weeks this morning and wrote another one. So you can invite me back again and I'll talk about my life, okay? But today's sermon is called The Faith and Works of a 21st Century Transcendentalist. Okay? And the motivation to do this goes back to the early days of our marriage, when after 20 years of being a full-time parish minister, 25 years, I was no longer a parish minister at all. And what we discovered was after a while, on Sunday mornings, the tone of our breakfast would change. And I'd suddenly kind of begin to take over the conversation, shall we say. And I realized, I was just like that horse who you let him out of the barn and he goes in the same direction. Sunday morning, and I got everybody needs to be quiet for 20 minutes and let me have my say. And except I didn't have that. Kathleen was willing to be quiet, but my newly acquired 13-year-old stepdaughter always had something to say back to me. And we would have these wonderful discussions of the first times really that I started bonding with Erica. And so that was really cool. Now, since then, I've been preaching a little bit as of late because I retired in 2017, but came back to do an occasional gig, and that's good. It keeps me from going insane, actually. And also what I found during those 50 years, maybe 2 or 3 times, I would throw out the sermon that I'd been working on because the Times demanded it. And literally it was the Times. It was the New York Times. I read the New York Times this morning and it scared me so badly, I had to write another sermon. Donald Trump, do you remember where he was speaking from yesterday? Where Donald Trump was speaking? He was speaking from an old munitions factory of the Confederacy in Columbus, Georgia. Remember when Reagan placed the wreaths on the SS soldiers at Bitburg? That was nothing compared to what Trump did in terms of being offensive. George Wallace standing in front of the school saying segregation forever. That was nothing compared to what Donald Trump did yesterday. And the rhetoric of his supporters. There's going to be a lot of discussion in the media in the next few weeks is what qualifies as inciting to riot, inciting to violence, fighting words. And so, what are Unitarian Universalists supposed to do in this current situation? What do we do? And I thought, well, what did we do last time? What was the Unitarian response to the prelude of the real Civil War and that war itself? Some of you may recall Reverend John Burns, who was the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association back in the 90s. Lovely fellow. He has recently wrote a book, it's about 2 years old, and it's called Conflagration: How the Transcendentalists Sparked the American Struggle for Racial, Gender, and Social Justice. And if you're at all interested in this topic, it's a really, really good book. Because I've been reading and studying about the Transcendentalists really since I was in high school. And it was always, here's Alcott, and here's Emerson, and here's Thoreau, and he brings them all together because they were all buddies. They all knew each other, all hang out, and it was a large group. It was a large minority within Unitarianism. They're almost all Unitarians. And there's a quote from Dickens when he came to visit America. And he said, these Transcendentalists, I'm not sure what it means. Seems like it can mean about most anything you want it to mean. But I'll tell you, if I was in America, I think I'd be a Transcendentalist. So I'm going to explain to you what Transcendentalism is. The Transcendentalists were the grandchildren of the Revolutionary War generation, okay, just chronologically. And the Revolutionary War generation was filthy with Unitarians because it came out of Boston and Philadelphia, a hotbed of Unitarianism. John Adams, Jefferson, but a lot of the signers of the Declaration of Sam Adams, a lot of people were Unitarians. And what they were deists. And a deist is sort of like believed in the clockwork universe. I think it's sort of hedging your bet toward atheism because they had kind of a scientific or pre-scientific point of view that God created the earth and then sort of cut out we're on our own. and that was deism. It was also part of taking on Puritanism and a revolt against Puritanism and a revolt against that irrational superstition. So they said, we have reason as well as revelation. That was sort of the shibboleth of Unitarianism back then. Reason and revelation together. And so that was what they were in the revolutionary times. And they were also into utilitarian philosophy. John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, the greatest good for the greatest number. Very, very practical men, almost all men except for Abigail Adams. And many of them became very rich. They became Boston Brahmins, the highest class in Boston. And the beliefs of Unitarianism then was said, they believed in the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, and the neighborhood of Boston. And many of them got very, very rich. And many of them had 3 names, like Samuel Eliot Morison, because you needed to know all the names, because you needed to know where the money came from, whether it was from the Eliot or from the Morison, and many times it was from both of them. And also a lot of these, the next generation, the ones that got very rich, they sent their kids to Europe for education, or at least for summers. And they ended up acquiring a lot of German philosophy and English Romantic poetry. And they brought it back here. And what that did is they began to, like children and grandchildren were due, rebel against the religion of their parents. So that deism, that reason and revelation, and Emerson's father was a Unitarian minister, and he did a famous address at the Divinity School where he used the term stone cold Unitarians because they were so rationalistic. And he was only a parish minister for a couple of years and said, I'm just going to write. And he did. So American Transcendentalism is basically the American version of the Romantic movement in Europe. They did add a couple of things. With Thoreau, they added the more spiritual aspect of it from Eastern philosophy, compensation, and a lot of his essays have to do almost with karma and things that we would now think of as being Eastern. But the Transcendentalists were always a minority within Unitarianism. Transcendentalist ministers were not welcome at all Unitarian churches. They were thought to be dangerous radicals theologically and politically. And basically what we're talking about, just like the hippies were the grandchildren of and the children of the World War II generation and the Depression, you know, that generation really was focused on survival and economic well-being. And of course, I grew up, everything was fine, so I could get high and dream of peace. That's what the Transcendentalists were. Now, meanwhile, the abolitionist movement was starting to grow too. And you may know the name William Lloyd Garrison and his magazine, newspaper, The Liberator. He was always the primary person within the early stages of the abolitionist movement. And he was what was called a Christian perfectionist. He was not a Unitarian by any stretch of the imagination. And a Christian perfectionist is a little bit like a Quaker, okay? And I don't know if you've ever worked with Quakers, but Quakers are wonderful people who are solidly planted where they are. They are not compromisers, including in terms of when the bathroom break should be. They are not compromisers. And this world of creation is a pale misrepresentation of what God intended it to be. And so what they meant is that William Lloyd Garrison's version of abolition was not to deal with politicians. Politicians was bad and dirty, and I didn't want to deal with it, and the Constitution is a bad slave document. Well, who wrote the Constitution? The Unitarian grandfathers. They didn't agree with that. Sure, it was compromised. It was literally compromised. But the thing that the Transcendentalists took with them from their grandfathers was, oh yeah, we're going to get involved in politics. Oh yeah, that's what we're going to do. And they brought that to the abolitionist movement. One of the first things that William Lloyd Garrison messed up on was women. There was a divide within the movement as to whether women should be allowed to speak at abolitionist movements or not. This was a big deal. So nationally, there was the abolitionist movement where women could speak, and there was where they couldn't. And the Transcendentalist says, this is BS. Of course women can speak. Get over it. Having people like Margaret Fuller in your club, more or less, sort of helped that along. And it was extremely sympathetic to women's suffrage and abolition, and extremely rare, but also, again, not accepted in all Unitarian churches. There were others that were more interested in maintaining the status quo. But you recall that in 1847, Europe exploded into revolutions all over Europe. And a few years later, in America, there was the Missouri Compromise, which is the flashpoint of violence in the Civil War. Because for the first time in a long time, the Missouri Compromise was that new states could vote whether they would be free or slave. And that was a compromise that was not going to go well, either in the North or the South. And it was fought primarily between Missouri and Kansas. You know, there were the raiders that came up from Missouri. That's how the James Gang got started. They were originally raiders into Kansas. And Kansas had one person who made a big influence, though, a guy named John Brown, who was a mad Old Testament prophecy of freedom. And after Harper's Ferry and the hanging of John Brown, there was an investigation into who funded John Brown. And there were 6 names that came up. 2 of them were Unitarian ministers. One of them was Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who may be my all-time favorite Unitarian minister. He only spent 2 years in the parish ministry. He couldn't find a job. But he led the first black regiment in the Civil War. It was gathered in the South, and he was the captain of that regiment. And while he was there, he listened to what the men were singing at night, and he wrote down for the first time the lyrics of what was called the Negro Spirituals. So the first written account we have of that musical tradition comes from a Unitarian minister. He was also one of the first people to lift weights. His first time, probably one of the first people who didn't work hard enough that he had enough energy left over. But he did, and he was part of what became a whole movement of physical culture within Christianity and so on. And then, since he couldn't get a job in the ministry, he took a job as an editor at Harper's, and he developed a correspondence with the New England poet. And he introduced Emily Dickinson to the people. If it wasn't for his encouragement, we would have never known her. So this is a guy, he lifted weights, he wrote black spirituals, and he introduced, he's my guy. Wow. And he raised a lot of money for John Brown. The other guy is Theodore Parker. He's a little bit better known. He wrote a little something that got picked up. He wrote "Of the People, by the People, and for the People." He also wrote something else. He was the original one who wrote the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. That was a Unitarian minister who wrote that, a white Unitarian minister, because that's all there were back then. But the best statement of Unitarian Transcendentalist faith was in 1862. Julia Ward Howe was born into an ordinary, if not impoverished family, but her brother married into the Astors. So she had a little bit of walking around money. And a disastrous marriage, a completely disastrous marriage. Not that she was alone in that, but she was the most articulate one about the terribleness of her marriage. And if you want to find out more about her, just read her Wikipedia page. It's very interesting. What a person, what a person. Gradually, as she became more famous, the marriage became a little less disastrous for her. And she went down to have a meeting with Abraham Lincoln in 1862, because she did that kind of stuff. And she was with that evening a minister named James Freeman Clarke, who was actually kind of the John Burns of his generation. And if John Burns knew I was calling him that, he would be very happy. James Freeman Clarke had the biggest church in Boston. He was kind of a transcendentalist, but kind of not. He was kind of in the middle of everything. He was kind of the Joe Biden of the Republican Party. You always knew right where the middle was. And that's a useful place to be if you have some goodwill and brains, okay? So that was James Freeman Clarke. And he's with Julia Ward Howe, and they're playing John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. And he says, you know, you ought to be able to write some better lyrics than that. And like the next day, the Battle Hymn of the Republic was written. And that is the key to Unitarian response to the Civil War, and it won the Civil War. The key line in that is, as he died to make men holy, as Jesus died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. That's the ultimate romantic gesture. You know, Lord Byron, liberty expiring in Mishlongi, you know, the ultimate romantic gesture, the embodiment of transcendentalism, to sacrifice one's life to the greater cause of a free humanity. And one of the greatest embodiments of that is a guy named Robert Gould Shaw. Robert Gould Shaw, you may remember, Matthew Broderick played him in a movie from 1992 called Glory. And he played the colonel, or the captain of the 54th Regiment.
That's playing.
Yeah, and it showed how at first he was a little reticent to take on the job of being the captain to a black regiment, the first regular black regiment that were Union soldiers, officially Union soldiers. And he took that on. It's a great movie. And some people say it's the most realistic Civil War movie ever made. And Robert Gould Shaw was a Unitarian. He grew up in Staten Island at the Unitarian Church that was formed in 1852. His father, George Francis Shaw, was immensely rich. His great-great-grandfather was on the first boat to China with John Jay. That's how on board to the China trade his family was. And Francis George Shaw, Robert Gould Shaw's father, was one of 9 children. And the father, who was a Congregationalist, George said, I don't want to be a businessman. I want to write poetry. He says, look, we're rich enough for all of you. Go do what you want. So he moved to Staten Island and wrote poetry and helped fund the Republican Party. He was one of the main funders of the Republican Party. He was good friends with John C. Fremont, who was the first Republican candidate. And his son was Robert Gould Shaw. Hey, buddy. And so Robert Gould Shaw, both of the captains of the first 2 black regiments were Unitarians. Now we died to make them free. And Robert Gould Shaw died at the Battle of Fort Wagner. And the Confederates as it says clearly in that movie, threw him in an unmarked grave with the black soldiers he died with. And later they said, okay, we have to move his body and give him a proper burial. And his parents said, no, leave him there. That's where he wants to be. He wants to be with his men. And 2 months after Fort Wagner, when the black men proved their mettle in combat, over 100,000 black men volunteered for the Union Army in 2 months. And the history that I learned was that toward the end of the war, there were even some black soldiers. That's the way I learned it. You think Jackie Robinson was a big deal? He was. But we're talking about 100,000 Jackie Robinsons, because remember, Jackie Robinson was a US soldier before he was a Dodger. And the North went on to win the Civil War and lose the peace. And Jim Crow became the new shackles, which are still worn by too many today. So here's the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would have said, to Julia Ward Howe. The Civil War was so devastating on both sides. I wish somebody would show those goddamn Republicans in the House the casualty figures in the South from the first Civil War. They got their ass handed to them and their civilization was destroyed. And that's what they're asking for? 10 days after Julia Ward Howe wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic, she wrote the first Mother's Day proclamation with the experience of having experienced the Civil War. She wrote then, "We will not have great questions decided by a relevant agency." And this is one of the best lines I've ever read. "Our husbands shall not come to us reeking with carnage for caresses and applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. We women of one country will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs." And every American grows up to know the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and no American grows up to know the Mother's Day Proclamation. So what have we learned from fellow Unitarians in the Civil War? 1, democracy is not a spectator sport, and that nonviolence must be the path. Not that we will convert the world, but we must acknowledge and find our own ways of atonement for the many acts of political and civil violence that we have failed to avert and sometimes been complicit. If we know our Unitarian history, we act more wisely today. William Faulkner said, "The past is never dead. It's not even the past." There's a monument on Beacon Street in Boston to Robert Gould Shaw and the soldiers. It took 30 years for it to be built. You know why? Because when August St. Gaudens first conceived of it, it was Robert Gould Shaw on a horse. And Robert Gould Shaw's mother said, "No, I want the rest of them there too." And it took Robert St. another 12 years to craft the black soldiers into that monument. It's across from the State House, right down the street from where the Unitarian headquarters used to be, which is also the same street where Robert Gould Shaw's original family home was before they moved to Staten Island. But anyhow, they had a dedication to the monument in 1897, and William James was the keynote speaker. And William James in 1897, after having invented psychology and political and religious philosophy of religion, he was probably the #1 intellectual in America. And I just recently found out one of the first Americans to take mescaline. So so good, so cool. But this is from what he said at the dedication to that monument in the past is never dead aspect. The deadliest enemies of nations are not their foreign foes. They always dwell within their borders. And from these internal enemies, civilization is always in need of being saved. The nation blessed above all nations is she in whom the civic genius of the people does the saving day by day, by acts without eternal picturesqueness, by speaking, writing, voting reasonably, by smiting corruption swiftly, by good temper between parties, by the people knowing the true office holders when they see them, and prefer them as leaders to rabid partisans or empty quacks. Such nations have no need of wars to save them. Their account with righteousness is always even, and God's judgments do not have to overtake them fitfully in blood spasms and convulsions. And this finally. The secret and glory of our people consists in nothing but two common habits, two inveterate habits carried into public life. Habits so homely that they lend themselves to no rhetorical expression, yet habits more precious perhaps than any that the human race has gained. This is, keep in mind, this is 1897, now listen to this. They can never be too often pointed out or praised. One of them is the habit of trained and disciplined good temper towards the opposite party when it fairly wins its innings. And the other, that the fierce and merciless resentment toward every man or set of men who overstep the lawful bounds of fairness or break the public peace.
Yes.
So we talk about faith and works here. Faith is that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And works is what Martin Luther King said to a group of college students in the 1960s when he was expecting to speak to 500 people, and there was a terrific snowstorm and about 20 showed up. So I brought those 20 people up on the stage and sat down in chairs and talked to them for 2 hours. And amongst them, he said, the arc of the moral universe is long. It bends toward justice, but you gotta grab a hold and pull. Thanks.
I mean, really.
Yes.
I think we should just all stand and give Darrell a hand. That was amazing. And it was just so good today. You know, facing what we're facing. And what I was saying about we live in this bumper car era, right? Like Trump making that speech where he made it just bumped you off the path you were on. You were going to come talk about something else. So we'll have to have you back next year. Will you come back next year and tell us about your life? Just tell them don't read the paper in the morning. So we can hear about his life. Or read the paper and give another speech and it was keep in mind.
We just keep pushing it down.
Once a week, you'll be like Wendy. You come back once a year and visit this little Peter Pan congregation. There you go. There you go. Yeah, it was so brilliant, so good. I can't even begin to tell you. But I think mainly because you threw away your sermon and reacted to the moment. And that is the times we're in. And you gotta know, I think, this is the point that you're making to us. You gotta know where to hold on when the boat car hits you. And so you went to our faith, you went to the great thinkers of our tradition, and you brought them to us, and you can help us all feel like, rubber cooled straw. What we don't know what will be asked of us in the future, but if we can understand the deep roots of commitment to love and justice and compassion.
It's being asked of us now.
Yeah, exactly. Then we can live up to the people we would like to be. So, brilliant. These are very talky people. Somebody else besides me might want to say something. Somebody else besides me want to say something? God for your friend.
I did have a question. So, how did the Transcendentalists get along with the Universalists? And how did they get kind of pushed out and the Universalists take hold?
Well, the Universalists were not very much in the Northeast. The Universalists were always more of a Midwestern, and so I'm not even sure if there was a Universalist special denomination. They were always very dispersed. And in terms of polity, this is a North and South sort of thing, because the Unitarians were national. They were more like federal, and the Universalists were state by state. They were more of a confederacy. They had a very weak national organization. And at that point, they would have felt that slaves and slave owners both would all go to heaven. Because that's the nature of Universalists. I don't think that you don't see Universalist names on the list of Transcendentalists or abolitionists because they weren't quite in the game. Where you get the most telling idea of Universalism is a guy named Pullman, who owned a railroad. And on the one hand, he gave some of the first black folks to have middle class incomes, jobs because there were porters. There were Pullman porters. And when there was a Pullman strike, he clamped down on them. And you think there's an irony there. The lawyer for Pullman was Todd Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's son opposed the Pullman strike. And there's a great movie called 10,000 Men Named George, which Andre Brower, it was his baby. And he's a member of the Unitarian Church in Montclair. So, Unitarians are everywhere, but you just don't know it. They're anti-evangelists. And there are so many examples that I can give in my personal life of Unitarians doing amazing things and never knowing that they're Unitarian. So, but anyhow, to get back to Universalism, that wouldn't have been really a factor. The Universalist church that I started out serving down in rural North Carolina was formed in 1888. And they started coming in after the Civil War, where it was kind of a reaction against fundamentalism. And part of it was that so many young people were killed during the Civil War that the theology of dividing the saved to the unsaved, the people just couldn't handle that. And so Universalism became more of the theology and there's more about
Yeah, just have to ask you, from all of this, what impact do you think this has on the Universalist Church?
We mean the Unitarian Universalist Church now? Yeah. I've been retired since 2017, and I was a part-time minister for the last 10 years, and the part I left out was the denomination, gratefully, and So I haven't been connected with that really since John Burns was president back in the 90s. But from what I see, we're becoming a social justice congregation, for better or worse. And some people think it's for better, and some people say it's for worse. Because when you draw a line, some people are going to be inside the line, some people are going to be outside the line. You know, yeah. And that's church politics. I saw it back in the 80s when suddenly there were a lot of women in the church. You know, because I graduated from Divinity School in '73, and there were just starting to be women in Divinity schools then. I spent the first 15 years, I went to Unitarian ministers meetings, and I never sat with a woman until I moved up to Boston. There was one. And a couple of years later, there was two. A couple of years after that, there were three. And when three's a minion of women ministers in Unitarian Universalist. Because when the third woman joined, the culture changed in the state.
It's actually been recommended if you're going to be on a board, or as a woman, you're going to be on a board or something like that. I'm sure there's 3 women.
Really?
Yes, it's actually a recommendation. Not 1, not 2, it's 3. Otherwise, you just get shut down by the men.
Still.
But if there's 3, good.
Yeah.
Gary, jump in here.
Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
I got 2 movie recommendations, Glory and the 10,000 Guys Named George. There was a book that you mentioned in the middle, and I didn't catch it. I was wondering if you would say
Well,
it
I
again.
think that's the book by John Burns, and it has a long subtitle, as every book seems to have, but it's called Conflagration. And the guy's name is John Burns. It's kind of strange to spell, but if you go to Conflagration, John Burns, Transcendental, you'll find it easy enough.
Figuring it must be on these notes.
Probably on the first or second.
Was that in the first draft?
Uehren's.
B.
Uehren's. And the full title is Conflagration: How the Transcendentalists Sparked the American Struggle for Racial, Gender, and Social Justice.
Yeah, and a lot of what the historical stuff comes from that book.
All right. I think it's like, 5 o'clock, time to have some
Yeah.
drink or some soda, some snacks. This was great. What a way to close the year.
Maybe we can hear a little bit of Bill before we close out.
You got it.
Yes.
Can't blow out a candle. You can do something. Thank you one and all for coming. More conversation